This is a card so powerful that it's been banned for 15 years. This card is considered part of the Power 9, a collection of the most powerful cards ever printed in Magic the Gathering. This card is considered S tier by virtually all Slay the Spire tier lists, while this one is just okay. Hello there ladies and gentlemen, I'm Simon from Games Deconstructed and I'm here today to talk about drawing cards. Strap in, give the subscribe button a tender yet decisive pat if you haven't already, and let's delve into the world of card draw immediately afterwards. Cards are a resource. Having more cards than your opponent generally allows you to do more as a result. Let's take YuGiOh, a great example for this, as it's a game that has relatively little restrictions on how many cards a turn you can play. Let's look at a very bare-bones hypothetical scenario. I've got a bet going with my opponent, the object of which is to do as much damage as possible on turn 1. No card restrictions whatsoever. My opponent, a veritable mastermind who hasn't heard of combos somehow, decides to stick their deck chock full of Ookazi, the highest direct damage spell they know.
That's why I'm not gonna lose.
Which, to be fair, beats a deck of 50 Hinotamas. So the Oppo rolls up to the table with their death stack of Ookazis while I unveil my creation, 25 Pots of Greed and 25 Ookazis. You start a game of YuGiOh with 5 cards. That means that my opponent's damage cap is 4000 damage on the first turn, which is a valiant effort. It's the same for me should I draw 5 Ookazis as well, but should I start with, say, 4 Ookazis in a Pot of Greed, which I'd cast and draw maybe 2 more Ookazis, I'd win our bet right there, 4800 damage. And instead of drawing into Ookazis, I could of course draw into more Pots of Greed, couldn't I? And every cast of Pot of Greed increases the number of cards I have, so it's entirely possible that I'd draw my whole deck before I whiff. Which would look something like this.
Draw! Draw! Draw!
5 minutes later.
Draw!
As a result, allowing me to drown my opponent in the 25 direct damage cards I've drawn. I won't bore you with the exact math on the deck's average damage output on the first turn, but it shows you clearly that having more cards than your opponent, all other things being equal, is a good thing. And you're right, that would never happen in a real game, because in real games it's worse. And that's in part due to the snowball effect, because basically every deck in every card game is some sort of an engine that's constructed over the course of the whole match. And an engine requires an initial input of resources, which can be cards, mana, health, or even time, to output more of different resources, for example changing cards into damage. If you're able to assemble or feed your engine before your opponent does, you will be able to outpace them or straight up disallow them from ever using their engine. The fact that cards are resources in games is also why sticking draw a card on pretty much anything tends to make it better. Each card you play has a base cost of 1 card. You played it, it's no longer in your hand, your card number goes from 5 to 4 or whatever. But cards that replace themselves work around that base cost, which sometimes leads to silly stuff. Unlike the example provided a moment ago, a typical deck would have a far wider variety of different cards. Part of the reason is that most games only allow 2, 3 or 4 copies of a single card in your deck, but another part of the reason is that different cards are useful or even optimal in different situations. And due to that idea, having a wider variety of cards available to you at any given moment is going to make sure that you're better equipped to handle any situation the game throws at you without wasting resources, time, or effort. If I need to answer a small creature, I can play Lightning Bolt instead of Doomblade. Then, if my opponent decides to play a massive chunker, that Doomblade is still in my hand, waiting for its perfect moment. If I only had Doomblade and not Lightning Bolt, I might have used it on the first creature, and found myself woefully underprepared to deal with the Colossal Dreadmaw. The ability to select between 2 different cards in my hand allowed me to be better prepared to win the game. And the best way to make sure that my hand is filled with a variety of cards from my deck is to draw them faster than I need to spend them. Hence, card draw good. Some card games are played with the implicit assumption that you will not see all the cards in your deck during a single match. Magic the Gathering is in most cases one of these games. It's also a game that has a hard cap of 4 copies maximum of any given card. And as a result, the reliability of strategies relying on a single particular card to win is directly linked to how many cards they draw. There might be cards that you don't want in your opening hand and shuffle into your deck at the beginning of the game in a process known as a mulligan. It might be a game-ending finisher that's unfortunately unplayable before turn 6, but if your ability to close out the game relies on it, shuffling it back into your deck can be a risky proposition, as you'll be at the mercy of your one card draw per turn. But in a deck that can draw double or triple that on average, your probability of seeing that card again before turn 6 or turn 7 skyrockets. Many card games make use of sequencing, mechanically incentivizing playing cards in the right order. If you're interested in how they do that, you might like my video on sequencing in digital card games, which you can watch by clicking on the card in the corner of the screen or the link in the description. Anyway, working with the assumption that playing cards in a given order has a better effect than playing them randomly, we can assume that having more combinations to choose from has a higher chance of yielding one that's vastly more powerful than the others. So if I have 2 cards in hand, I can play them in 2 different orders, but should I draw a third, the number of combinations goes up to 6, and that's assuming I want to play all of them. If not, there's also a number of 2-card sequences I can choose from. If I'm playing a game that does incentivize proper sequencing, I would assume that having to choose between 6 sequences would yield greater results, as a result of requiring more skill from the player. It's also offering the player more choices, which might make them feel either more skillful and engaged, or paralyzed by the sheer number of decision-making opportunities. But the distinction between these two states has more to do with other elements of your game, independent from just card draw. It's also why, if you're confident you will be drawing a card, do that before you play anything else. Seeing what you drew will inform your sequencing decisions better and allow for more combinations. The first and most intuitive idea to balance card draw is to place it within the same constraints that other cards in most games go through, and that's ascribing a cost to them. So if cards in your game cost mana, energy, or another resource that limits the number of cards you can play a turn, drawing cards is not going to be a no-brainer, but more of a trade-off if you have to pay for them. To gauge whether playing a card draw ability is more beneficial to you than playing a similarly costed card that you already have, you're going to have to compare the effect that card would give you with the potential gains in reliability, card selection, and sequencing that you would get from drawing an unknown card from your deck. Both this turn and in the future, as you might be keeping the new card for an unknown length of time if it's a finisher or an answer to a problem that you do not yet have. From a developer's perspective, it's even harder to get this type of balancing right. In the player example, the player would have to be aware of all the possible permutations within the confines of the single match they are playing, but the dev has to take into account the average of an astounding number of different matches, different cards that the card draw ability will contend with, and possible combos, and then come up with a concrete answer to the question whether that card should cost 2 or 3 mana. And there's no easy way about this. The knowledge of how to properly cost card draw in your game will come from playtesting and a robust understanding of other systems in your game. But even ascribing a cost that's much too low to a card draw ability will create some trade-offs, unlike designs like Pot of Greed. Consider the Slade's Adrenaline costs 0. Actually, it gives you energy, so I guess it costs -1. So not only does it net you cards, but also allows you to possibly play more of them than in the case of not using Adrenaline. Playing it is a no-brainer. Apart from a niche case of one boss, you always prefer to play Adrenaline if given the chance. While Acrobatics is a decent card. It nets you +1 card, might work with any discard synergies you might have, but it also costs 1 energy. As a result, every time you play it, you have to consider whether that 1 energy would not have been better spent elsewhere. If I have more energy than I can spend, it's a no-brainer. But if I have a couple of expensive cards in hand that I'll be unable to play if I draw, but even better cards in my deck, it's a gamble. If all my best cards are in hand and playing acrobatics will prevent me from playing some of them, it's just a mistake. Just by ascribing a cost to the card, we have created a new decision space. Another avenue to pursue in making card draw less of a no-brainer is what Spire and its 1100 successors have done, and that's lack of hand permanency, or in actual people talk, having to discard unused cards at the end of your turn. Because even if drawing cards is costly, it's often a good idea to draw either way, because even if what you draw is not useful immediately, it might come in handy later. But players will be much less likely to default to the strategy of just drawing cards in situations of uncertainty if that card draw is going to go to waste if they are unable to make use of it. It also simplifies the calculation I've mentioned previously. Now it's only worth drawing a card if the average impact of the cards drawn this turn is larger than playing what you already have in hand. So you don't need to correct for the impact of having these cards in the future, because you're just going to discard them at the end of turn. These roguelike deck builders also often feature a mechanic, nearly universally called retain because of Spire, that allows you to keep some cards at the end of turn. These change the situation towards some degree of hand permanency, but come with costs of their own, both deck building and expressed in terms of energy or mana. Competitive card games also attempt to utilize lack of card or hand permanency from time to time. A mechanic I'm familiar with in MTG is what's called impulsive draw, which effectively draws you a card that you can only use until end of turn because it disappears afterwards. Finally, if we can add a negative to drawing cards, this may also serve as a balancing factor. Generally, including a lose condition on running out of cards in your deck, as well as a viable way for an opponent to remove cards from said deck, often referred to as milling cards, will punish greedy drawing habits. Alternatively, for example in a non-competitive card game, such as one of the Spire successors, you could include an enemy that receives a buff or inflicts damage for every X cards drawn by the player. The possibility of happening upon that foe will cause the player to think twice before stuffing their deck with every card draw tool available. Or at least cause them to sweat a bit whilst trying to work around the enemy being a direct counter to their preferred strategy. Keep in mind, however, that drawing cards is generally a feel-good mechanic, so players might react negatively to being punished for utilizing it. Even alternatively, you could link cards to another mechanic, like life totals. Netrunner CCG equated hand size with health, but another idea could be to connect your deck size to your HP. Every time you receive damage, you mill, burn, or your preferred parlance for removing an equivalent number of cards from your deck. In a game like this, drawing cards would be equivalent to taking damage, an additional cost that's built into the mechanic as a whole without the need to print it out on every card that draws cards. Please let me know in the comments what card game mechanics, design paradigms, and what have you you'd like to see featured in future videos. For the time being, I'd be very grateful if you hit like, subscribe, or the bell icon on this video, because it really helps with the algorithm recognizing my content as valuable. But for now, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.